Okay. All right. So I'm going to do a little review, but I'll also give some background on this first. All right. So we covered this extensively pretty early on because I remember pulling a couple of these articles. Almost as soon as the DEI thing burst onto the scene, there was a lot of criticism that ultimately the whole perspective of the anti-racist industry was very racist, that it was reinforcing racial antagonism. And this was not just something that you would find on the Daily Wire. This was a point of view you'd find in the New York Times, lib, rag, in good standing. And this article's from 2021 originally, I think. Over the years, social scientists who have conducted careful reviews of the evidence base for diversity training have frequently come to discouraging conclusions. Though diversity training workshops have been around in one form or another since at least the 1960s, few of them are ever subjected to rigorous evaluation. And those that are mostly appear to have little or no positive long term effects. The lack of evidence is, quote, disappointing, wrote Elizabeth Levy Pollock of Princeton and her co authors in a 2021 annual review of psychology article. Quote, considering the frequency with which calls for diversity training emerge in the wake of widely publicized instances of discriminatory conduct. Dr. Pollock's term found that just two large experimental studies in the previous decade that attempted to evaluate the effects of diversity training and met basic quality benchmarks. Other researchers have been similarly unimpressed. Quote, we have been speaking to employers about this research for more than a decade, wrote the sociologist Frank Dobbin and Alexandra Kalev in 2018, with the message that diversity training is likely the most expensive and least effective diversity program around. Parenthesis, parenthetical. To be fair, not all of these critiques apply as sharply to voluntary diversity training. If diversity training had no impact whatsoever, that would mean that perhaps billions of dollars are being wasted annually in the United States on these efforts. But there's a darker possibility. Some diversity initiatives might actually worsen the DEI climates of the organizations that pay for them. So you started to get this very early on. Now, Robin DiAngelo, who you might know, got humiliated by this film, really. There she is, the original. This is in New York Magazine. I believe this was 2021. Um, is the anti racism training industry just peddling white supremacy? And he tells one of the most famous stories about Robin DiAngelo's white fragility. Matt Taibbi actually did a great article dwelling on this. Out of DiAngelo's one of DiAngelo's favorite examples is instructive. She uses the famous story of Jackie Robinson. Rather than say he broke through the color line, she instructs people instead to describe him as, quote, Jackie Robinson, the first black man whites allowed to play Major League Baseball. It is true, of course, that Robinson was not the first black man who was good enough at baseball to make a major league roster. The Brooklyn Dodgers decided, out of a combination of idealism and self interest, to violate the norm against signing black players. And Robinson was chosen due to a combination of his skill and extraordinary personality that allowed him to withstand the backlash in store for the first black major leaguer. It is not an accident that DeAngelo changes the story to eliminate Robinson's agency and obscure his heroic qualities. It's the point. Her program treats individual merit as a myth to be debunked. Even a figure as remarkable as Robinson is reduced to a mere pawn of systemic oppression. So yes, this is one of the things that from pretty early on in the show we did cover and speak out against, not because I personally don't think that there is systemic racism. It's because I've always seen this as a grift and as part of an effort to divide people, and particularly when you talk about people like Robin DiAngelo, who charges outrageous sums, or Ibram X. Kendi, ditto. It's a big grift. It's a big grift. It is very much like the war on terror, the way that they frame racism. It's a problem that can never be resolved, which is very convenient if that's how you make your living. If you're making your living off ginning up racial tension, they have no interest in actually solving it. And I don't think it's an accident that, as the previous article said, uh, studies strongly suggest that it actually makes things worse. That's very good for business. Um, so by the time this movie is coming out, um, this whole industry, this whole grift is already collapsing. You can see multiple headlines. Google, Meta cut their programs. Microsoft fired the DEI team. Even Hollywood has been firing the DEI executives. Ford, Coors Light are retreating from the gay rights index. They don't want to be ranked on it anymore because they've been getting a lot of pressure. So I think the greatest example of the fact that this house of cards was already collapsing is the fact that this film got a wide release without a lot of pushback. I can't imagine that 3 years ago you wouldn't have had massive pressure on the theaters not to have the film. Um, so this brings us to Matt Walsh's "Am I Racist?" Which he just dropped. Now, not following the cultural trend, the critics are embargoing it the same way they embargoed "What Is a Woman?" You could see 99% audience score, but only fringe outlets, independent outlets. I'm not trying to denigrate them, but just pointing out you don't have the New York Times here, you don't have the Washington Post here. None of those, because so many of these journalists rely on access to people in Hollywood. And Hollywood, this film is anathema. They don't want to burn their bridges, so they will not review it. So this is, as far as I can tell, there's literally one theater in the country that caved to activist pressure and pulled the movie. A theater in this lives of TikTok. A theater in California canceled their showing of "Am I Racist?" after left-wing activists bullied them. They caved to the pressure and are now claiming the movie causes division and can harm their staff. Cowards! But that's it. That's it. And that really tells you something about where we are. This is Matt Walsh. It's Matt Walsh. It's the Daily Wire. It's a film questioning the entire anti-racist DEI grift, and that's it. One theater in the whole country. So the times, they are a changing. Now, this is kind of a good sign of how the times are changing. So these people all got paid for their appearances in the films, all of these DEI trainers. And at one time, if this film had come out at one time, they would have been running a cancel campaign against everyone involved in this film. Instead, they have all deleted their accounts, including Robin DiAngelo has deleted her account, because they have essentially been canceled after the release of this film, at least on social media. Um, Another sign of the changing times: Variety, Hollywood Reporter, they're all reporting on this as a movie. They're not writing their articles with a tone of apoplectic outrage. They're treating it as a movie with a right to exist, which was very different from the coverage of his previous film, What Is a Woman? So they say a couple of interesting things in here about what's happening with the industry and what the implications of the what we now know is the success of this movie is. It's released in 1,500 theaters. That's a pretty normal release. That's a wide release. Um, Quote, "They're leaving plenty of money on the table, and we're happy to come in and take some of it. Because at a minimum, you are explicitly refusing to serve 50% of the audience," Walsh says, "of Hollywood's aversion to red state sensibilities. There's no denying the film's studio level production values," which must be pretty low if he's telling the truth, because he was talking about Borat on his own show in one of his own segments and how people were comparing it to Borat. And Borat, he said the budget was 18 million, and I think he said our budget was 1/19th of that. So under $1 million, according to Walsh.
Well, don't forget too, in 2024, you could make a movie look great for much, much cheaper than you could in
It's true.
2006.
That's true.
2006, now you could shoot a movie that looks like that on your phone. That's literally true now. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, the
yeah,
movie certainly doesn't look cheap. It
right,
doesn't have
right.
that look to it. There's no denying the film's studio level production values. In fact, several of the principals hail from traditional Hollywood backgrounds. Producer Dallas Saunier was a manager who broke the careers. This is pretty funny given where he ends up. Broke the careers of Greta Gerwig and Leslie Headland. Those of you in the know will know Leslie Headland as the creator of the much despised Acolyte, before fleeing the mainstream industry because of its politicized nature, he says. Director Justin Folk worked on the visual effects teams of such films as The Matrix Reloaded before bailing to tackle stories, quote, more about the war of ideas and what's going on in our country, as he describes it. And Boring ran Coattails Entertainment with Zachary Levi before teaming up with Shapiro. I didn't know that. Quote, Hollywood is focused on its own problems internally and can't even contemplate what would resonate with an audience in the South or the Midwest today, Saunier says. Conservative audiences have simply checked out of what Hollywood is making outside of the tent poles. As Walsh sees it, the once fertile genre of low budget comedy is a wide open lane. Quote, the left was using satire to mock the views that they disagree with, he says, noting Sacha Baron Cohen's Borat playbook. Comedy died in Hollywood at some point. It just fell off a cliff. It got to a point where you can't make jokes about anything anymore. There's no one left that you can even poke fun at except for white men, I suppose. But after a while, those jokes get pretty old too. So then, everything's stale. And I think it's where we are now. Um, well said. And that's something that I'm finding very interesting. And I agree with everything they're saying there. Look, you got a huge swath of the country, as has long been predicted. Disney's is collapsing, even in its animation division, except when it occasionally releases an animated movie that doesn't have any politics to it. Half the country, at least, is conservative. They don't want these kinds of messages in their movies, and Hollywood refuses to make movies that are going to cater to that audience. So eventually, it was inevitable they're going to start to go somewhere else for that content, and nature abhors a vacuum. And naturally, you're hearing all these stories from screenwriters and experienced people about how they can't get hired anymore. You have to check certain diversity boxes to get a job. Inevitably, they were going to go somewhere to start making their own stuff. Eventually, you're going to find somebody, you're leaving an enormous market opportunity, which so far Daily Wire is best seizing on. But Hollywood cannot forever continue to make movies that people don't like, that they find offensive, that nobody wants to watch. And, so far, this particular production company is doing the best job of capitalizing on that. Okay, so um, we know now it is done very well. In the biggest surprise of the weekend, conservative provocateur Matt Walsh's Am I Racist opened in fourth place with an estimated 4.8 million from 1,517 locations, the top debut of 2024 so far for a doc, and the third biggest since Disney's nature film Bears a decade ago. Am I Racist is doing big business in conservative markets in the South, Midwest, and Mountain States, which is exactly what he was saying. These are underserved markets, and they're seizing an opportunity. All right, so to get to the film, I'm not going to play this because who knows? We don't want to get flagged on copyright. But all right, so the movie opens with this real footage of he got this morning news show in Utah to think he was a diversity trainer. And right from the beginning, the movie is pretty funny. telling them they have to spread their arms out to get rid of their whiteness. But the one on the right is Asian. He said, "This isn't so much for you. This is for her." All right, so this is something I've said about Matt Walsh a lot. Jimmy actually repeated it to him when he was interviewing him. Um, yeah, Matt Walsh, he gets what he is. He talks about how this used to be the province of the left. It was, and that is what's so almost bizarro world about Matt Walsh. Somebody with his comic talents, and more than that, his comic sensibility. This very dry, sarcastic, lampooning social mores that belonged to the left. That was a left pose. That was a counterculture left comedy pose. But because the liberal class have come to dominate the mainstream of the culture, um, a guy like Walsh with those talents, how could he even do comedy from the left? He'd get canceled. He has to do it from the right. He'd get if he built his business relationships in the left, could he make this movie? I think a guy like this 30 years ago, he would have been trying to get on SNL. That is what I honestly believe about Matt Walsh. I think today, in the current climate, if you really want to be a bomb thrower, if you really want to be a gadfly in the entertainment space, you'd almost be forced to find your financing in the conservative ecosystem. Whatever your personal politics, where else would you be able to get the support to do something like this? Um, so this is kind of the end of the movie, or where he ends up and says, "Okay, so how did I get here?" Um, all right, so he goes on a series of very much like What is a Woman. He set up a series of interviews with different DEI practitioners. The first one he speaks to, this was pretty funny, and again, he's bringing out these core contradictions and hypocrisies. Um, the DEI trainer that he's interviewing, she says, with my kids, even with them, even with me talking to them, he said, how young is too young to talk to them about DEI? 6 months too young? I don't think it's ever too young. Even my children, I see them watching the Disney princesses and they pick the white princess. He says, yeah, well, my daughter picks Moana, but then she wants the Moana costume for Halloween, and then that's appropriation, right? So what do I do? I want her to pick the non-white princess, but then what if she wants to dress as the non-white princess? Do I get her that? And
Right.
you can see like he's very clever that way. He's very funny, has a great comic mind. And he did a great job here exposing those contradictions. He goes and he speaks to some kind of salt of the earth black people and church people, a guy who works in a garage who, don't support these ideas. He goes to a biker bar where, again, the people are kind of conveyed as very salt of the earth. Like, I don't care what color you are. And I'm not putting on this accent to make fun of them. It's in that part of the country. That was really the way they spoke. I don't care what color you are. Now, look, is that selective? Can you very well find people in a biker bar who don't have those views? Yes. But I think it's fair enough to show, given that the cliche would be that people like that all are, these virulent deplorables. I think it's fair enough to debunk that, and I think it's fair enough, given that the cliche that all black people support these ideas, when really it's this very tiny intellectual elite that mostly is not of color. It is mostly white people. It's fair enough to show that most of that community doesn't really like this approach to race relations. Um, so he goes on this odyssey. He goes to the very famous, white women at dinner thing, and that was particularly funny. He went in with the COVID mask there. I guess he was afraid he'd get recognized. He infiltrated as a waiter because men are not allowed there. So as they're lambasting these white women, eventually he says, you're making a great point. They need to hear this. They all need
Right.
it. Can I sit down? Can I it just disrupts the whole thing. So that was great, but of course the thing that everybody is talking about is Robin DiAngelo who this is the funny thing. You want to see how online is not real life. You say, how could Robin D'Angelo not have known who Matt Walsh is? But apparently she did not. So this is one of the funniest things in the movie. This is one of his producers, Ben, for real, who is black. And so Matt Walsh takes money out of his wallet and hands him reparations. And Robin D'Angelo says that was really weird. It's like, why? She said, well, reparations is more of an institutional thing. So, well, I'm not going to wait for institutions. Why should I wait for institutions? I want to give them reparations. And there's this uncomfortable silence. She's like, do, do you want me to give you money? And she goes and gets her wallet. So the whole movie, it was very well made. And again, he brings out a very interesting contradiction in this philosophy, because I think we all know by the time the government would pass reparations, good luck with that. Okay, so you believe so much in reparations. Why don't you create a fund? Create a reparations fund. She charged $15,000 for this 2-hour interview. She's got plenty of money. Why don't you start a fund? Yeah, I mean, it's not a solution by itself, but all the people who believe this, who are well off like she is, why don't you start a fund? So it does, I think, raise a deeper issue, because he said, why should we wait for institutions? And it's actually a valid point. As much as it's funny, it does, again, expose a certain hypocrisy in this entire movement. Now, of course, Robin D'Angelo released a statement because she's deeply humiliated, along with everybody else who appeared in this. Um, as part of her statement, can you take that off?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
Back in 2023, I was contacted by a group who claimed to be making a documentary film called Shades of Justice about efforts to address racism in the United States. They plan to interview anti-racist activists, authors, and thought leaders in service of supporting the cause of racial equity. They offered me between $10,000 and $20,000 for an interview. I said, let's meet in the middle with $15,000, and agreed to participate. I have since donated that sum to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. When I arrived for the interview, a few
So then why
things
didn't you
felt
take the 20 if you were donating it?
well, no. I mean, she's saying she donated it after she found out that
That she
this
was
was a
conned.
con, that she
Okay,
was
so then why
conned.
why
Yeah.
not 10? Let's meet in the middle.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, this is they get paid, these
Oh,
trainers.
it's
I think
huge money. Yeah,
they get paid like $2,000 an
yeah,
hour
yeah. It's
for
huge
these
money. Yeah.
trainings. When I arrived for the interview, a few things felt off. The grips would not make eye contact with me, and the interviewer, who was introduced as Matt, appeared to be wearing an ill fitting wig. Matt presented himself as someone new to anti racist work and seemed earnest, and his questions did not come across as adversarial. By the end, however, things got weird. Matt asked what I thought about reparations for Black Americans. I said that I agreed with reparations, but that it was not my area of expertise. He then pulled up a chair and invited a black crew member who went by Ben to sit with us, took out his wallet, and handed Ben some cash. He said that if I believed in reparations, I should also give Ben cash. While some black people have asked white people to engage in reparations by giving directly to individuals, reparations are generally understood as a systemic approach to past and current injustice. The way Matt set this up felt intended to put Ben and I on the spot. Because Matt was pushing this on us, I expressed my discomfort and checked in with Ben to be sure he was okay with receiving cash in this way. Ben reassured me that he was, so I went to my wallet and handed him my cash, and the interview ended. Now, I don't want to spoil the whole movie, but there's other things that go on in that scene that are fucking hilarious. Really, really, really funny. Um, so his kind of closing is he paid people off Craigslist to come to his racial training. And some of the funniest stuff in the movie is in that. So I took a couple of screenshots. So just that alone, the chart he's showing them racism is not binary, and the shades of racism. And he makes everyone in the room. He has a chart from 1 to 10 and makes them put up a marker of where they are on the racism scale. And he wheels in this guy in a white beater, claiming it's his Uncle Frank, who told a racist joke 20 years ago, and he tells the joke and berates him. And hey, not to digress too much, but if you want to know why I'm skeptical of collectivist kind of efforts, it's because it is so easy to get people to go along with anything if they feel like it's what the group wants to go along with. So Walsh, with his very clever, sharp comic mind, set up a situation where if you're a reasonable person, bringing in an old man in a wheelchair to berate him for a joke he made about Mexicans 20 years ago is ridiculous. But after he berates him, Uncle Frank, I haven't been able to. There's not one day I have not thought about that. He gets other people in the room to go, "Fuck you, Uncle Frank," like that. That's how easy it is to get people to do something that is obviously horrible. There's like an old man in a wheelchair. Really? That's how easy it is to goad you into cursing this guy out for making a crude joke 20 years ago. So he makes his point pretty well there. So yeah, it was a very good movie. I thought his final message was actually something I would wholly agree with, even though I don't agree with Matt Walsh on many other things. Um, as cliche as it might sound, yeah, we're never going to have a perfect society, but loving each other is the answer. It really is. It really is the only answer. Now, that does not mean that there shouldn't be remediation, that there shouldn't be reform, which based on his interview with Jimmy, I don't think he would really support in regards to the carceral state. I'm not trying to sweep all that under the rug. Again, I'm not one of those who dismisses the idea of institutionalized racism. I just think these people are grifting off it. I don't think they're trying to solve it. That has always been my exception. But when you get into a lot of their core philosophy, it seems designed to make the problem worse. You look at that Martin Luther King message, which one of the people that he has, and that's in the trailer, he says, well, MLK, said we should judge each other by the content of our character. And they know they have to get around MLK to teach what they're teaching. She goes, yeah, well, Martin Luther King said a lot of things. Okay. Well, do you see this tactic as making race relations better or worse? Because I will tell you, as much as we don't like Barack Obama around these parts, um, the Barack Obama presidency is a result of Martin Luther King's ideas penetrating enough of society to get a black man elected. This stuff has only created it's almost like we were going in a good direction and it sent everything spinning backward in a lot of respects. Um, so look, I mean, I think there's on the part of Matt Walsh personally and the politics he represents generally, there's a willful blindness to the realities of real racism and real oppression and real problems that we still have in our culture. But him pointing out that this is not the way to solve them, he did that brilliantly with this film. And whatever your politics, I would highly recommend it for that reason.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I didn't see the movie. But I mean, it sounds like more, a skewering of this PMC grifter class, which I
Yeah,
see as totally detached from racism and anti-racism. I mean, it's just a wrestling show.
right.
And I never had any attachment to academia. I always thought all of academia was a cult. It was all a grift from top to bottom, and they're just part of it. But I would have to say, and like I said, I have not seen the movie. Um, I think to view racism as how we feel about each other, whether we like each other or don't like each other, is not quite the most productive way to look at that. Like, yeah, no, racism is the fact that black people had to do hard time for crack cocaine and white people got off with a
Exactly.
slap on the wrist for powder cocaine. That's what racism is, to the extent that most black people I know give a shit about it.
Exactly.
My first girlfriend was half black, and so I had a little bit more insight than the average person into like the way black people cared about how white people viewed them. the black people I knew didn't give a shit if white people liked them or didn't like them in the privacy of their own home. They cared about how they were treated not only by individuals, but how they were treated in the society, right? So we had black neighbors who basically lived in our backyard growing up. I grew up in a white suburb, and when my parents bought the house, there was this plot of land in back of the house that they didn't buy when they bought the property. And so a black couple bought it, built a house on it, and they lived right next to us, same size house as us, same class as us, same everything. And every once in a while, when my black neighbor was driving home through the white suburb, he'd get pulled over by a cop for no reason, no taillight, nothing. License registration. Okay, what are you doing? I'm going home. Check the address on my license. You'll see where I'm going. Oh, okay, good. You're free to go. Only reason he stopped is because that's what I think black people mind. And that's what they mean when they talk about racism. They don't talk about in Matt Walsh's heart, he doesn't harbor any resentment towards us. Okay, well, that's kind of meaningless in real life. In real life, as it pertains to like how people actually live and how people are able to function. And
yes, go on.
No, and so I think just on one level, giving Robin DiAngelo and I know he's not giving her respect. And look, these people are worth skewering because they deserve it. How many of these anti-racist academics, these DEI champions, have had one word to say about what's going on now post October 7th about Israel Gaza? Anything? Any of these anti-racists have a word to say about the genocide? Too many of the
people who pay them
Gaza?
Would be pissed off about it.
Exactly, because they couldn't get a gig anymore. So yeah, they've had it coming, and that's fine. And it seems like this is fairly funny movie, and so that's all fine. But I do think to say that because we went into this biker bar and asked people if they see color and they said no, which is not all that surprising that they would say no, that means racism isn't as big a problem as people think it is. I think that is intentionally not only reductive, but probably deceptive. And given Matt Walsh's politics, I would say it's more the latter because he is a pretty smart person.
As I said, you could certainly find people who don't like, is that selective who he decided to put in the movie? Obviously. But given that the narrative is so much in the other direction in the mainstream media, that's why I say I'll give that a pass. Because, I mean, it's to show the deplorables not being portrayed that way. I think it has value as a counterbalancing narrative, given that the dominant narrative is so much in the other direction. So does he really need to go in that direction? I mean, that's kind of the point. He's showing another way of looking at it, or another dimension to people that you would normally get in the corporate media narrative. And also with Robin DiAngelo, this is what always strikes me when I read her observations, and she does it here too. It very much strikes you, if you don't have these hangups, as she's built a career around projecting her own racial hangups onto all white people. She starts talking about, if I go into a supermarket and there are black people there, I'm going to be conscious of there being black people there. Well, maybe you're a fucking racist. Like, maybe that's your whole career. And this always struck me, being a native New Yorker, when I would see these people who, it was before they even really had the phrase, but when I was doing theater, you'd have all these white kids who came from these chalk white, lily white towns who wanted to talk all about diversity, but they were so very much like Robin DiAngelo. They were as squirmy and awkward around non-white people as you could imagine in their efforts to like not be a racist. Whereas if you grow up in a diverse place, this is not top of mind with you all the time. If you grow up with people from all around the world, you're not walking around. There's a black person in the supermarket. No, you're really not. I live in fucking Harlem. What do you think? Every time I walk out of my house, I'm like, black person, black person. Like, it's insane what she's saying, but I think it appeals to people of her class because people who are paying her tens of thousands of dollars to tell them this shit probably have similar hangups.
Well, yeah, look, I grew up, I mean, the greater area that I grew up in and worked in and went to school in was a third black, a third brown, a third white. And so every workplace, when I was a young guy, or even when I was not so, even when I was, I worked UPS warehouse when I was 33, right? So like every job I had, the workforce was extremely diverse. Some of the stupid jobs made you sit through the diversity training PowerPoint thing. Some didn't. There was absolutely zero difference in how we got along with each other, how we interacted with it. Absolutely zero. It is a giant money suck. That's all it is.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, give the people who run that and profit off that what's coming to them. Like I said, I'm hamstrung by what I can say because I didn't see the movie. And so we already know what people think about us opining without watching the entirety of a certain piece of content.
Yes.
So I'm hamstrung as to what I could say. But that's the impression I get. I get the
Well,
impression, based
yeah.
on his politics and based on what you're saying, that, yes, I mean, it seems to be a well-executed skewering of these professional class grifters, but I would be curious to see if it conflates, if it reduces the issue of racism down to that. Because, and this is the danger of people like Kendi and D'Angelo, because they're so ridiculous, they make
Right.
concerns about racism look ridiculous.
I
And he
agree.
seems like the kind of person who would capitalize on that and try to make the point that, see, you really don't have to worry about racism all that much because Robin DiAngelo is a grifter. That's a logical leap that I would posit he makes. Again, I don't know. Don't come at me. I'm not saying it for sure. I'm asking. Russell saw it. I didn't. That's all.
I mean, he doesn't go as far as to really articulate a point of view like that. He's certainly making a case for MLK's a restoration of the colorblind society. He's certainly making a case for, let's go back to content of our character and just love each other and
Okay, but
deal with each other as people.
MLK realized that was impossible without a dismantling, frankly, ultimately, of militarism and of capitalism.
Yeah,
And
you're
he's
not
down
going
with
to
that.
get that from him.
You're not going to get that. So then that's really not the MLK's vision. That's what I mean. You're reducing MLK's vision to let's all love each other.
Well, everybody
Right?
does, right?
And that's why it's politically manipulative.
Nobody ever talks about the Poor People's Campaign or the
Right.
later parts of his career as anti-militarism. They only talk about the parts that they like. But I'm saying, insofar as the film is focused on anti-racism, it's basically arguing, yeah, we need to get away from that and get back to this, which is true as far as it goes. That's why I'm saying, like, I don't think you're going to watch this movie as somebody on the left, if you're kind of anti-woke left, and feel like he's slipping in these other messages. That's what I mean. He doesn't really address that. Like, he's just talking about this.
Yes, I
and
understand.
on the level he's just talking about this, it was inoffensive on that level, because he doesn't really go there. He doesn't really get into that.
Please clap.